Hey friends, welcome back. This is Ashley with Uncommon Roots Homestead, and today this is a little bit of a different video. It's getting late. It's only 8:30, so I guess it could be later, but I like to be asleep by then. We've been working on the dishes, but I have been baking. It's Friday. I've been baking pretty much all day yesterday, all day today, and I'm working on my last batch of bagels right now. And I'm doing all of this baking because we have sweet friends who are trying to fund their adoption, and domestic adoption here in the US is pretty expensive. So they're doing a fundraiser to help fund their adoption, and they asked us if we would be interested in donating some eggs. And then my friend Morgan called me and was like, hey, what about, you could do, something else on top of eggs. And I thought, actually I'll make some sourdough bread and I'll do some bagels and I'll just do it as direct donation only. We don't want to have to go through the hassle of all the other stuff because we don't formally sell right now anything. So we figured we would, have some bread, some bagels, some eggs, and people could directly donate and then take what they want. So that means I've been playing house with the market selling and baking the last couple days. And let me just say, I have a newfound appreciation for people who bake for market. It is no small feat, especially if you're at the farmer's market and you're supporting a new startup baker who's baking out of their home kitchen, which is one thing that's really great about cottage laws in most states in the United States, is that you can bake sourdough bread or bagels at home and sell them at market. It's a great way for people who are new and trying to kind of test the waters to be able to see whether or not they have the skills that it would take to invest in, a facility and things like that at scale. Well, I had never really thought what goes into that. Like, how do you actually prepare for market? And let me just say that it is no joke. I have been baking, like I said, for the last 48 hours. I'll be up early tomorrow boiling and baking all of these bagels that I've been making. And at this point, I have made 21. So over the last 48 hours, I have made 21 loaves of sourdough bread, which that might not sound like a ton, but every loaf of sourdough bread takes 24 hours. So I did them in batches of 10, but I had to start that dough 24 hours before I even started baking it. And then it took me 8 hours to bake each batch of 10. So it is no small feat to have 20 loaves of bread in this container. And then I will have baked about 40 bagels by the time the morning rolls around, and we have about 20 dozen eggs to sell. And I figured I would show you guys a little bit of what we're doing and then bring you with us to the market tomorrow. It's our first taste at this, like I said, and I can't say that, going to market is something that we have really seriously considered, but I think it's a good opportunity to see what it would be like if we were market gardeners or decided to bake and go to market on a more regular basis. So I'm gonna finish up these bagels and I'll bring you with me. All right, so Kevin is in here washing eggs, and I am working on these bagels. So these are the ones I already formed. This is that next batch that I'm about to form. So these are those 1 hour bagels that I shared my recipe for a couple weeks ago. These are my favorite bagels. They're super easy. They're just a good option whether you're making to sell or making a large quantity, or you're just kind of behind the 8 ball like I usually am on a Saturday morning and your family wants bagels. So I went with this recipe because I was already doing all of the other sourdough things, and that felt like too much to add sourdough bagels. So what I'm doing now is I'm portioning out. So if I was just making these for my family, I don't worry about this step, but because I'm making them to sell, I'm portioning them out and making sure every single bagel is right at or right around 150 grams. I know that that's gonna make a really good size bagel, and that's what we're looking for because we are selling these because it is for a charity. If we were just selling at a farmer's market, we probably would price ourselves a little bit lower, but because this is a fundraiser, we're selling these bagels at $3 a piece or 2 for $5, and the sourdough bread loaves we're selling at $10 a piece, and then eggs we're selling at $7 a dozen. So yes, those are just slightly higher than you would see at a farmer's market, but again, it's for a good cause. So people are donating directly to their adoption. So come at me. Good morning, friends. It is bright and early, and we have been baking these bagels. They look so good, and they smell so good, and I still, by the second, am gaining more respect for market bakers. What do you think, babe?
Market bakers? Yeah. They, all respect to them.
Like, how do you, if you were a market baker, how do you handle the, like, mess that you create? Because I feel like I've been baking literally at this point for like 50 hours, 55 hours, and we're still not done. But it smells delicious.
And we just
The
started
bagels look delicious. And I mean, I baked all the bread. So we are gonna finish up here, load up, and head over to the market. I've got all of the things for our display, so fingers crossed.
Yeah, 48 from here. Share this corner. It's fine.
Let's try to play the scene. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Small fingers.
So I should just make it because all right, so that was our first vendor fair, and there are a couple of things that in hindsight I think I didn't understand or appreciate. So the entire day I was telling people, like, people would ask like, oh, are you going to be at any other markets or things like that, and I kept saying like, no, we don't bake for market usually, but I have a whole new appreciation for people who do. Baking for market is no easy task. I started baking about 50 hours before the market itself. So I made sourdough bread, yeast bagels, and then we brought farm fresh eggs. Well, sourdough bread takes 24 hours to create a loaf, essentially, more if you count feeding your starter. So on Wednesday morning, I got my starter out of the fridge and I fed it. And then Wednesday evening, I made my first batch of dough, and I made I multiplied my recipe by 10 times to make 10 loaves. And I have that giant stainless steel bowl. Thankfully, I'm not sure what I would have done without that bowl. And so I mixed it, I did my stretch and folds, and I let it bulk rise over the evening. And then once it had bulk rised, then in the morning, I separated it out, and that's where I had a little bit of kind of like the hiccup, right? I didn't have the oven capacity or the bannetons to shape and do my like second rise or second proof like there. I didn't have the ability to do that. And I also didn't have the ability to put all of the dough in the fridge at the same time. And so some of my loaves ended up a little bit overproofed, but I did some like tightening and some things to kind of keep that at bay. And ultimately, even if sourdough bread is a little bit overproofed, it's really delicious, and it still was really airy, and I didn't feel like it was too dense. But like, those are things I hadn't even taken into account. So if I was gonna bake for market all of the time, I would definitely wanna have a baking fridge, like a separate fridge that I only use for baking. I would want to have at least 10 banneton baskets so that I could shape the dough and actually put it in the fridge to stop the fermentation so that it wouldn't be overproofed when I went to bake it. Also, I had 2 Dutch ovens. I don't really think that that was as much of the problem as, like, it wasn't how long it took me to bake. I was able to, you guys know I work full time. I was able to just work downstairs from the kitchen while my loaves were baking. So every 2 loaves took an hour to bake. So I baked basically all day Thursday. I did the same thing Thursday night into Friday, baked all day Friday. And then Saturday morning was just reserved for bagels. And so what I had been doing is, in between all of this sourdough baking and like all of the different steps that sourdough takes, because it's a pretty involved process, I was making bagel dough, and I was making the dough, kneading the dough in my KitchenAid. Like, shout out to my KitchenAid. Without that, I would not have been able to bake for this market. And then like I was letting it knead, and then I was taking it out, letting it rest, and then shaping it, and then putting them into the freezer. And so I had done that on Thursday and on Friday. So I had 40 bagels that were in the freezer. Some of them were in the fridge. The ones I finished late Friday, I just put right into the fridge, just again to slow down the fermentation. And like to keep them from like rising too much and the overproofing. But then what happened was all of my bagels in the freezer, I took them out Friday night so that Saturday morning I'd be able to bake them. Well, I hadn't really taken into consideration how long it was going to take them to defrost, and they defrosted much sooner than anticipated. And so what actually happened is some of my bagels ended up overproofed and just a little bit larger and like kind of stickier than I wanted them to be. They still were delicious. Again, it's like these little things that a baker would notice that the general public probably wouldn't notice, and it's still 100 times better than anything that you're gonna buy, you know, that was pre-made and frozen at the grocery store. So those were kind of my key learnings. I did walk away thinking I could do this. Like I could bake for market more often. It was a lot of fun. I love baking. There are just some things that I would want to do differently next time and maybe set up a little bit differently. Ultimately, you don't know what you don't know, and I had no idea what went into baking for market. So if you're thinking about baking for market, or that's something that's kind of like a dream of yours, learn from my mistakes. Make sure you have some of that infrastructure in place, or at least a plan in place beforehand. The biggest thing that I could say is I'm so glad I thought to start on Wednesday instead of waiting until Thursday or Friday. I never would have been able to make enough bread if I had waited any longer. So those are my learnings. Thank you for joining us at our first ever vendor fair. You always have a space wherever we go. Until next time.